Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, which is organized by the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict, ELAC, here at the Blavatnik School of Government. My name is Professor Dapo Akande. I'm co-director of ELAC, and it's a pleasure to have you all attending this webinar. The purpose of this webinar is to launch a report which we at ELAC have been working on now for over a year on cyber due diligence. And the focus of this research is looking at the obligations of states to prevent or to put an end to harmful cyber operations which might occur from their territory or which might use cyber infrastructure under their jurisdiction. And what we've been doing is looking at what international law has to say about the obligations of states in this regard. This is a question that has been of keen interest in international relations recently. Obviously, we've seen a huge rise in harmful and malicious cyber operations, many of them conducted by non-state armed groups and, non-state actors. And the question then is, what obligations do states have when these operations arise from their territory? And conducting this research and launching this report, which is now available for you all to read and to download over the past 15 months or more, have been two researchers who've been working here at ELAC. Dr. Talita Dias, who was a research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict, who is now a junior research fellow at Jesus College, Oxford, and Dr. Antonio Coco, who was a visiting fellow here at ELAC, but who is also a lecturer at the University of Essex Law School. So this report, this handsome report, is their handiwork primarily, and they will be here to talk about the report. In addition, we have a number of people to help discuss the findings. First of all, we have the moderator of the event, Professor Duncan Hollis. Professor Hollis is the Laura H. Carnell Professor of Law at Temple Law School. He has conducted extensive research on various areas of international law, and he was from 2016 until very recently a member of the Organization of American States Inter-American Juridical Committee. And there he was rapporteur on a couple of projects, one on binding and non-binding agreements, but also he was rapporteur on a project on improving the transparency of state views on international law's application to cyberspace. And I should mention that in addition to those tasks, Duncan is also co-convener of the Oxford process on the application of international law to cyberspace, which we at ELAC have the honor of co-hosting and co-organizing with him and others. So he will be moderating this event. As discussants, we have Mr. Tomohiro Mikanagi. Mr. Mikanagi is Deputy Director General of the International Legal Affairs Bureau of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan. So he's the Deputy Legal Advisor of the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In addition to his extensive work as a government legal advisor, he is also an accomplished writer, and he has written and published in top international law journals on a variety of legal issues. And in this respect, I should mention that he has recently published an article on precisely this topic of due diligence with respect to cyber operations. I should also acknowledge that this project has received generous funding from the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we're very grateful to them for funding this project. And last but by no means least is Professor Joanna Kulesza, who is also one of our discussants. She is Assistant Professor of International Law at the Faculty of Law and Administration at the University of Lodz in Poland. Also a distinguished academic. She's an expert in this field. She has written a book on due diligence in international law. And in addition to her academic accomplishments, she's also worked in a number of projects. She's on the scientific committee supporting the European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency. and she's also been representing European users at ICANN's at-large advisory committee. So thank you very much to all of you for joining us today, and let me hand over to Duncan, who will then take over and moderate this event. Over to you, Duncan.
Well, thank you, Dapo. It's a real pleasure to be back at Oxford for another event, and I couldn't be more pleased to be able to moderate this discussion. For viewers who are not familiar, the due diligence work is a very impressive attempt to try and reconcile not just this question of how does due diligence fit international law, but to situate the whole international legal order in cyberspace. So I urge you to take a look at it. I mean, it walks through the broad question of the applicability of international law to cyberspace and tackles that thorny question of what is cyberspace anyway. There's the typology of the harms that we might be concerned about in the cyber context, and then addresses fundamental questions of sovereignty and jurisdiction, and how one thinks about or conceptualizes sovereignty and the jurisdictional rights and responsibilities that go along with it, how that would implicate what is the core of the report. And that is this idea of due diligence. I'll say duties rather than a single obligation of due diligence. I hope that's not too much of a spoiler for the conversation to come. And then wraps up with a pretty interesting survey of different legal, technical, organizational, and other modalities for implementing the international law obligations that the authors of the report have identified here. So that's a very short preview. It is well worth your time, and if I haven't convinced you yet, I hope the conversation to come will do so. So let's just dive in. I don't think we have that much time with us here. So Tomohiro, I wonder if I might start with you. I think since the government of Japan was among the key sponsors of the project, I wonder what you make of the need for this project, right? I know there's an existential debate out there about whether due diligence is a general principle of international law or just a best practice without any legal force. What do you personally make of that debate? Why are states having it? Is it really a debate about the construction of international law, or might it be motivated by other concerns, the potential liability of states who might play host to malicious cyber behavior, for example? So just kind of broadly, if you might tell us a little bit about why you think that we need this project, I'd welcome your views.
Thank you, Duncan, for a good question. This project is designed and implemented by Dapo, Talita, and Antonio, but it came up in a conversation in 2019, I think. In 2017, UNGGE failed to adopt final report, and there was a very strong pessimism about the discussion on the application of international law on cyber activities. And one of the reasons I thought was kind of this existential debate relating to due diligence. But in 2019, there are two resolutions adopted at UN, starting new GG discussion and also something called OEWG. So I thought we should start something new to stimulate discussion on cyber due diligence. And with regard to the reason why states are having difficulty in accepting the existence of this general international law obligation, I think there are two reasons. One is the rapidly changing technological situation. States tend to hesitate to take a firm position on something changing and developing rapidly. And this due diligence principle or obligation is at the core of the very delicate balance between the freedom of internet and state territorial sovereignty. And states naturally hesitate to take a firm position to decide on this delicate issue. That is one reason why states tend to hesitate. The second reason is ambiguity of this concept of due diligence. I think international lawyers know Coke Channel judgment confirmed the existence of due diligence principle. But if you are asked to what extent states or territorial states have to monitor and regulate cyber activities emanating from their territory, it's not an easy question to answer. So I think these are two reasons. One is rapidly changing technological or maybe technological power balance, and also the ambiguity of the concept are two reasons. And that was exactly why I asked Dapo and his colleagues to start the discussion and research on this matter. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think that those are both, I think the idea of rapid technological change, and as you say, actually the power balance is pretty interesting, and alongside the ambiguity of an obligation that all international lawyers learn about, but perhaps we don't see applied or discussed in practice as much as we might, and building, of course, on the work of the UNGGE, which I hope we can return to. But maybe Joanna, if I could bring you in, I think as someone who's kind of literally written a book on this topic, I wonder where you personally come down on the existential question, right? For like, how important do you think it is to have states acknowledge the existence of one or more due diligence obligations in international law? I know that the report says there are, I think, 17 states who come out in favor of some version of due diligence as international law, but 4 who do not, who reject that categorization. You know, is this counting exercise something that matters? Do we need the views of more states? How do you approach this issue?
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you for having me participate in this discussion, and thank you to the Japanese Foreign Ministry for supporting this report. I think it is a very handy tool to respond to your question, Duncan. I am, as you know personally, a strong believer in international law. I look for feasible solutions, and I strongly believe that due diligence in itself is this feasible tool we can recommend to the states to better attend to cyber challenges, whatever these might be. You will see this detailed in the report, and I hope we will get to those details as we progress with this conversation. But to focus on the question, I do believe that due diligence is useful, and I do believe that counting the votes or the positions of the states, as our authors have done, is indeed useful. But we might need to take this a step further. We might need to convince the unconvinced, but also we might want to accompany the research which we have done as international lawyers on state responsibility, international liability, and due diligence with a very pragmatic, practical set of tools. What does it mean to be diligent in cyberspace? This is a step that the report is taking. And I strongly believe that if we manage to convince the states who are still on the edge, so to speak, or who strongly oppose, for various, at times, political reasons, the concept of due diligence, we will be able to move this discussion forward. I think there is a feasible comparison to us as researchers working on international law, state responsibility, and due diligence with the work that is being done right now around COVID vaccines. Those researchers have tangible proof in their hands, and there still is work to be done to convince the unconvinced. It might be similar for us. We might be convinced that due diligence is the one tool we want the states to use, but there's still work to be done for this paradigm to become feasible. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'm going to stop here and let you take the floor, Duncan. Thank you.
So you've put us international lawyers in the category of not just observers, but advocates, right? So not enough to let the states make this, but there may need, as lawyers always do, some persuasive arguments about why this obligation not only exists, but why it should be embraced. Talita and Antonio, you've been patient as the authors of the report, been patiently waiting. Of course, I want to give you the opportunity to bring you in here now. Indeed, your report, I think, emphasizes the question of whether we can simply interpret existing rules of international law as applicable to cyber, or if we have to devise cyber-specific rules. I think you come out much more in the former camp than the latter. Can you say a bit more about the methodology? In particular, you kind of reject the need for positive evidence of international law's application in the cyber context and make your case for applying general rules of information law, general rules of international law to information and communication technologies?
So we're going to answer this question together.
Yeah.
We'll try.
So,
we're going to do our best. Antonio is going to start.
Perhaps I can start by saying that it is kind of evident that general international law is general. It's indeed one of the first things that we say in the report. And if we think about it, there are some rules of international law that are designed to be applied in specific contexts, but many rules of international law do not have that limitation. And when there is no such limitation, we should presume that the rule of international law applies generally in every context. According to this starting point, it is up to those that want to deny the applicability of certain rules of international law to information and communication technologies to demonstrate that there is state practice and opinio juris excluding those rules from application when we're talking about cyberspace, cyber operations, and more in general use of the internet and other technologies for communication and information. Sometimes the critics of this approach raise the concept of domain. We hear that there are some domains for which international rules of international law are made as if they are self-contained and rules are only applicable within the specific domain. Hence, being cyber a new domain, then we would need new evidence of practice or opinion juris. But as I said, the concept of domain is overrated to split international law in different boxes. In fact, there are many rules, by default, rules are not domain specific. And so this is our starting point. I'll leave it up to Talita to continue on this argument. Actually.
Yeah, so just to follow up on the point about domain. So obviously we find some rules of international law that are domain specific. So we have law of the sea, for example, that applies at sea. So that's quite obvious. But that's not the case of general rules of international law, which are by definition or inherently general, right? And if I give a couple of examples, we can think of non-intervention, we can think of sovereignty, and also we can think of due diligence, which is a general rule of international law. So that's kind of like our starting point, and then building on that, what we argue is that these rules, these general rules of international law, whether they are treaty rules, whether they are rules of customary international law, they can be interpreted and applied to new phenomena, including new information and communications technologies or other technologies for that matter. So they are by nature wide in scope because they're general. And so that means that they can be interpreted using the traditional rules of interpretation for treaties and for custom, to whatever phenomenon fits within their scope. So that's our sort of like main point. And then, as Antonio said, we look at the concept of domain, and we think that we shouldn't make too much of it, because it's, of course, as I said earlier, for some rules, domain serves as an exclusionary device to limit the scope of certain rules, but not necessarily for rules of general application. And so the idea of domain, for example, in the context of international humanitarian law, where the concept originally came about, in that particular context, domain is not used to exclude the application of the rules of IHL or international humanitarian law to certain particular domains. To the contrary, on the contrary, it's actually just a device that helps us understand the different areas, the different aspects of the battlefield to which rules of international humanitarian law apply. And then, Duncan, you mentioned that one of the contributions of our report is to tackle the thorny issue of what is cyberspace. And that's where we tackle this question. And we argue that we think that cyberspace is better perceived as a set of information and communications technologies rather than a domain. So sure, one can conceptualize cyberspace as a domain, as we can conceptualize territory as a domain, as we can conceptualize air, which is a physical thing, as a domain, right? So that's possible. Domain is just an abstraction. It's a human category. But we think that the complexity of cyber is best understood if we conceive it as a set of information and communications technologies that have different elements. And these elements, some of these elements have a physical nature, so that's hardware. So that's the computer that you're using to watch us today. That's hardware, but also logical components, so software, the Zoom software that you're using for this webinar is also a component. Data, so whatever information that software is processing is also part of these technologies. And most importantly, the personal component, so the human beings who actually devise those technologies and use those technologies, or who are affected by these technologies. So that's the idea. And our last point about this topic is that international law is technology neutral. And that is a point that was made in the chair's summary to the latest report of the open-ended working group on cyber. So the chair makes that point specifically about the tech neutrality of international law, just to say that, well, international law is not limited to certain technologies. It applies to any technology that is relevant to the scope of the rule. And that's something that the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, said already in the nuclear weapons advisory opinion with regards to weapons and international humanitarian law. So I guess that answers the question.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, I think it's a broad question, right? This existential question, but it is, of course, the kind of as a result, it's so critical, because if you can't agree on the application of this general rule, you're left. The rest of the report doesn't follow. But let's talk a little bit about the rest of the report, if we may. And Tomo, if I might come back to you, I think, again, as someone who's working in government, I wonder why. I think you've articulated some of the challenges to examining due diligence as a legal obligation, but can you say a little bit more about why you think we might need due diligence obligations? Particularly, what are the harms in cyberspace that you've observed that are most concerning to you? Is it threats to critical infrastructure, compromises of supply chain, or is it more the misinformation, disinformation? What are the sorts of threats that we should be concerned about and think about in this context?
Thank you. For me, I think critical infrastructure, threat to critical infrastructure is the most concerning, I think, threat posed by cyber operations. I think Colonial Pipeline incident was very good or bad example where due diligence obligation can or should play a role. And President Biden mentioned something like international standard relating to the response to this incident. I think this is exactly where due diligence should come up and play a role. Why critical infrastructure? Because there is a consensus, emerging consensus, that attack or cyber operation, harmful cyber operations against critical infrastructure is the most concerning or serious threat to the states, at least. And GG report repeatedly refers to threat to critical infrastructure. We don't have a clear definition of critical infrastructure, but I think COVID reminded us that healthcare system is really critical, and pipeline is, of course. So there are kind of common elements already kind of agreed by the government about what constitutes critical infrastructure. And I think it is, and this due diligence has become kind of a controversial issue among the states. I think it would be wise and better to have something we can agree with. And that is probably the importance of a critical infrastructure. And government would have more interest in protecting their critical infrastructure. And for that common purpose, we can talk about how we can cooperate among states. And due diligence can be a good tool, as Joanna rightly pointed out. it can be a very useful tool for cooperation rather than confrontation. Thank you.
Thank you. Joanna, maybe I'll turn to you. Are there particular harms for which you think the due diligence obligation is particularly appropriate or more appropriate than others?
Thank you. When we look at international law, there are two elements to this question, and I'm going to try and highlight both of these. When we look at the work of the International Law Commission and analyze where due diligence would come up most often, it would likely be with reference to the concept of significant transboundary harm, which is something that the authors of the report also referred to. Now, when we look at the notion of significant transboundary harm, we are equipped with a relatively specific framework. There is a description of what's significant, what transboundary, and what harm are. So that is relatively easy for us to say and put due diligence in the framework of international law on state responsibility and international liability as referred to by the International Law Commission. As I have highlighted in my previous intervention, I like to think of myself as a pragmatic international lawyer. So with all of that theory, I would ask myself, what does it mean in practical terms? And this is something that you're referring to in your question, and Tomo quite rightfully pointed out in his intervention. I fully agree that there might indeed be networks or communication channels that we might want to ensure the security of first. The like-minded countries, those who tend to support the notion of cybersecurity due diligence, at times use the concept of the core of the internet. This is something you will find in the report from the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, supported by the Dutch government and the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. So we would indeed have certain elements of the broadly defined cyberspace that might need immediate care and immediate attention. What these elements will be, whether it is going to be the core of the internet and how we define it, is to be specified by the states who are willing to adopt the due diligence principle in their activities. It might well be that this concept will be shifting. It might mean that DNS today, it might mean critical infrastructures tomorrow, but it might mean something completely different as we progress with the development of the internet, just to think about low orbit satellites that will facilitate connectivity in the future. So I like the idea of the core of the internet. I do understand it's not yet specific enough, but to me, this is the seed of the consensus we can use to transpose prevention of significant transboundary harm in cyberspace, detaching it from the original environmental law context. I'm going to stop here, but that's a lovely question. Thank you for asking it, Duncan.
No, thanks. Yeah, and I think, again, as we kind of are setting up here and we're kind of approaching the core of due diligence, right? I think it's important to both talk about the existential debate, but also the situated into the why we need it and what are the relevant harms. And I think, I think tackling it from both ends as you have done it is quite useful. Maybe I can turn again to our report's authors. Antonio, I thought I'd start with you. What exactly? Let me ask the basic question: what exactly is due diligence, and what do you mean by it? Is it a general principle of international law, standard of conduct, or what is it? And this is a two-part question. So what is it? And then whatever it is, how does it apply to cyber? Does it apply by default, or must we first kind of manifest some cyber-specific rules?
Thank you, Duncan. Indeed, that's the starting question for our inquiry. It's the first question that we asked when we started this research, and we try to answer it throughout. Let me give you a premise to my answer. The concept of due diligence exists beyond discussions on international law as it applies to cyberspace. It exists beyond the international law even, because it's a concept that we know from any area of law. Let's think about tort law, for example. It's also an expression that we use in common parlance. The difficulties that have arisen when discussing due diligence with respect to cyberspace and information and communication technologies derive from the fact that we associate by now the expression due diligence with a particular rule that requires a standard of due diligence, which is a rule that has been formulated in the Tallinn Manual and that has been inspired by case law, most notably the Corfu Channel judgment by the International Court of Justice, that states that affirms that states must not knowingly allow their territory to be used for acts contrary to the rights of other states. But this is the rule, and this rule must be implemented and complied with by behaving diligently. And this is the gist of our study, that in fact we should move away the discussion from talking about a specific rule, and we should instead look a bit more broadly at what rules of international law require states to behave diligently to prevent, redress, mitigate, minimize the risks of several cyber harms. The problem with focusing on one rule only, as it has been done in several debates recently, is that it becomes sort of a make it or break it point, all or nothing, that either you manage to prove that that rule exists or nothing is there. And this is actually misleading. Because whatever happens to that specific rule, we want to show that there is a number of other rules that are not contested, and whose application to information and communication technologies is not contested, that still require states to behave diligently with a view to obtaining certain results and to basically obtain protection for a number of beneficiaries. And in fact, and I will stop here, when we conceptualize rules that have this standard of due diligence, it's very easy to conceptualize them as a triangular relationship. There is a duty bearer that has to protect a beneficiary from a certain harm. And this is the structure that we find in all the rules that we analyze in the report. We identify the duty bearer, which it's usually or mostly states in our case, and then the beneficiary may change. It may be other states, it may be individuals in the case of international human rights law. It's still individuals and also states with respect to certain rules of international humanitarian law. It may be the environment at large for certain readings of the no harm principle. And what is the harm that the duty bearer has to protect the beneficiary from? That's the variety of cyber harms that we discuss in the report and that we see every day in the news: ransomware attacks, distributed denial of service attacks, theft of personal data, and so on and so forth. So we really want to move the discussion from discussing about a specific rule to highlighting that there are existing rules that are applicable and that protect certain categories of people against harmful cyber operations. And one last thing on the need to show evidence. We're not denying in the report that that rule that states discuss in the international fora like the GGE or the EWG or in their own statements, some say it exists, some say it doesn't. We do not deny that a rule that is specific for cyber may emerge, or on the contrary, it may emerge a rule that says that specifically when it comes to the cyber, to things that happen in cyberspace and through information and communication technologies, there is no a rule that requires states to behave diligently. This could emerge if we find sufficient state practice and opinio juris that point to the existence of that rule. But until we have that concluding evidence, let's say, we start from the baseline, which is the rules that nobody contests: international human rights law, IHL, the Corfu Channel principle, and the no harm principle, which we separate as they apply generally. So with that, I hope I've answered.
Well, I think you have. I particularly like how you situated it, not just as a general principle of international law, but a general principle of law, and from which then we see it manifested in the international legal context in some of the ways you've just alluded. But Talita, let me bring you in. Let's get to the heart of the report then, right? So I think as Antonio just suggested, I think one of the main contributions is to suggest moving past this bifurcated existential discussion of due diligence is absolutely law, singular in the cyber context or not, and that you explore it and you identify it as a patchwork of existing duties. So can you talk a little bit more about some of specifically what these existing duties are, how are they similar, how do they differ from each other, and of course, how do they manifest in the cyber context?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Antonio said, the idea of the patchwork approach, as we call it, or a patchwork of due diligence duties, is to really, instead of focusing on form or labels, so is due diligence a general principle of law? Is it a general principle of international law? Is it a cyber-specific rule? Well, it might be all of these things or one of these things, but the idea of our approach is to really focus on the substance of due diligence and what the standard means for states in practice. So we also have a very pragmatic approach to the issue. So focusing on the substance, what we found is that, as Antonio said, there's not just one, but a number of obligations that contain a due diligence standard. And what we argue in our report is that actually due diligence itself is better conceptualized as a standard, a flexible standard that is present in all of these rules that are spread across different areas of international law. And so going to the patchwork itself, so we find first and foremost two general rules, or two rules of general application, or some refer to these rules as general principles as well. And these are the Corfu channel, to which Antonio referred earlier. So the Corfu channel rule, as we like to call it, is the most well-known articulation of due diligence. And it was articulated in the case of the same name, an ICJ case back in 1949, the first ICJ case. And the rule says that states must not knowingly allow their territory to be used for acts that are contrary to the rights of other states. So that's the first one, the most well-known one, the rule that the Tallinn Manual Cyber Due Diligence rule mirrors. And then the second rule that we found, which is a bit underexplored in this area, is the so-called no harm principle. So the no harm principle is usually associated with environmental law, so protection of the environment, prevention of transboundary harms, and it became famous, or it was clearly articulated in that ILC, the International Law Commission's report on transboundary hazards, transboundary harms. But the ILC itself stressed that the concept of no harm, so the duty to prevent significant transboundary harm and also to redress it, doesn't apply only to the environment in an ecological sense, but it applies to harms to persons and also property. So it goes beyond the environment. So that's the second rule, and it's also a rule of general application. And then the third rule that we highlighted in our report, which isn't usually associated with due diligence per se, but it is at its heart a due diligence rule, or a set of rules, is positive human rights obligations, right? We tend to talk about human rights due diligence in the context of business and human rights, but it's actually also a positive duty of states to exercise due diligence in protecting human rights in a number of ways. And all human rights have a positive component to them. So for all human rights that are recognized in treaties and customary international law, states have a positive duty to protect them, right? So the right to life, right to health, privacy, freedom of expression, and so on and so forth. And finally, the fourth set of rules of a specific nature, like human rights law, that we found also contain a number of due diligence standards, is positive duties under international humanitarian law, or the laws of armed conflict. So first and foremost, we find a due diligence standard in the duty to ensure respect for the laws of international humanitarian law, to make sure that other parties to a conflict, other states that are involved in an armed conflict, respect the rules of international humanitarian law, but also duties to take precautions when attacking military targets, also duties to take due diligence in assessing new weapons. So a number of these duties are also found in IHL. So just to summarize some of the difference and some similarities very, very quickly. So as Antonio said, there's this triangular relationship that repeats itself in all of these rules. So you've got the duty bearer, which in our case is the state, or it could be an international organization. And then you've got the harm or the source of harm or the perpetrator, and the beneficiary of the rule, which could be an individual, another state, or something, an object like property or the environment. So that's one main similarity, right? Other similarities include, for example, all of these rules, they require some sort of nexus between the duty bearer and the harm. And in most of these rules, this nexus is manifested as the notion of jurisdiction. So Corfu Channel applies only within the state's jurisdiction, territory and jurisdiction. And the same goes for the no harm principle. And then in human rights law, we find a different conception of jurisdiction. So a human rights sort of like based jurisdiction. And then there are different conceptions of this jurisdiction, and we can talk about this later on. And then for IHL, International Humanitarian Law, there is no jurisdictional nexus whatsoever, right? So whatever the state is able to prevent, then it must. And then the other similarity is that all of these rules, they contain an element of knowledge. So knowledge is required for all of these rules or principles to be triggered. So the state must either know actually or constructively that the harm is forthcoming, right? To be able to prevent it. Otherwise, it would be unfair to impose such a duty on a state. And then all of these rules, they're triggered, and they're also limited by the capacity of each and every state to act. And that's the main strength of the principle or the rule of due diligence or the rules of due diligence, because it allows states to do what they can, right? So if you can do something, then you must do what you can. And finally, across all of these rules, there is a minimal capacity building requirement. So lack of capacity is no excuse. All states have to build sort of like the baseline of capacity, a state apparatus, so at the very least, law outlawing cybercrime and malicious cyber operations. So that's the bare minimum. And differences, so as I've mentioned when explaining the different rules, so we find differences in the types and thresholds of harm that trigger each and every one of these duties. So for example, Corfu acts that are contrary to the rights of other states, and no harm principle requires significant transboundary harm, as Joanna said. Human rights requires violations of human rights, and IHL, violations of IHL. The scope of duties is also different, and we're going to talk about this later on, I think. Different duties require duties to prevent, duties to redress, duties to mitigate, to investigate, violations, and so on and so forth. And the legal consequences that arise from lack of diligence or failure to prevent are different. And the main distinction here is between Corfu Channel, which requires the actual harm to be materialized for state responsibility to arise. And no harm principle, on the other hand, only triggers state responsibility if the state fails not only to avoid, to prevent the harm, but also it fails to redress the harm. So that's the concept of liability. So I think that's in a nutshell the patchwork and the similarities and differences.
Well, thanks. I got the 4 rules, right? Corfu, no harm, and then 2 manifestations, which I assume are just going off script. They're not exclusive. One could look to and the law of the sea or outer space law. I assume also find manifestations of this.
Absolutely,
yeah. So I like that, and I think I took from it that jurisdiction, knowledge, capacity with a floor are the commonalities, while thresholds and scope are the primary differentiators. So with that kind of quick attempt to summarize, Joanna, as someone who's written a book on this topic, I wonder how much this resonates with you, or you're curious as to your reactions to this claim of a patchwork approach.
Indeed, this is a very settling summary for me, because my research has pointed to a very similar flexible standard, which I think is good, which puts a certain convincing power into our hands as researchers and international lawyers. I love the phrase, I even put it down in writing in my notes. I love the phrase of due diligence being a flexible standard. That's a mantra I've been trying to advertise, and I welcome the fact that you guys have that in the report as well. I would view due diligence as this flexible standard that combines a non-disputable general principle of state responsibility and international liability that comes forward in environmental law, but also other regimes that you guys mentioned here, including, for example, diplomatic law. To me, the standard is focused around the concept of a good government that Talita just described in much detail, indicating that a good government would take certain measures in a certain circumstance. And this is the focus of the no harm principle. So I fully support that approach. I believe, and the ILC proves that in their reports and writings, that due diligence in itself was designed as a flexible standard, which is far better than the conversation about principles we've had thus far, because it very clearly fits the flexible nature of cyberspace, cyber conflict, and cybersecurity. So if we do manage, put it into more detail, indicating what these specific obligations for states mean in a given circumstance, we will be able to move forward. I noted a question in the Q&A pod, which we will get to at the end, that tackles this very issue. There's a question from Medes Malaholo. How does this concept reflect itself in practice, in law? And it does. If you look, for example, at the European approach to cybersecurity, you will find the NIS directive, which literally calls out for states to oblige critical infrastructure operators to do the best they can. There is a good business practice. You will find this also in the context of human rights law, as our authors have described. When you look at the GDPR, as contentious as it might be, it does focus on a due diligence standard for protecting personal data that is put into a very specific list of boxes that a state and effectively an administrator needs to tick. So we can detail this flexible standard into specific obligations depending on the nature of harm or potential damage we want to mitigate. So I fully support that approach, and I'm very much looking forward to further steps with us helping states and then identify what they can do to prevent cyber harms. Thank you.
No, thank you, and thanks for helping us answer some of the questions. I do want to, probably about 10 minutes after the hour, I do hope to reserve about 20 minutes for Q&A, and I see we've got 4 in the queue, but just to flag, there may be room for some more. Tomohiro, if I could bring you back to the stage in terms of the report notes that some states, and I'm thinking here the Czech Republic, Finland, France, the Netherlands, characterize due diligence in an undifferentiated way, whether they're focused on Corfu or they somehow kind of conflate Corfu and then what the authors here describe as the no harm principle, and they conflate it into a single binding obligation. Does that matter from a governmental perspective? What difference would it make for governments to recognize due diligence as a standard of conduct that implicates multiple duties rather than just one singular rule?
Thank you. Thank you for asking that question. Obviously, I can't speak for these states, and I understand that the main discussion on due diligence among states taking place around the Corfu Channel judgment. Maybe that is due to the influence of Tallinn Manual, but somehow states, many states equate due diligence principle to the Corfu Channel due diligence principle. And but this concept, Corfu Channel due diligence principle, comes from the territorial sovereignty defined by Max Huber, as you know, in Island of Palmas case. And no harm principle, I think, is also originating from the same concept of responsible territorial sovereignty. And other, two elements, Talita and Antonio, or 2 kinds of due diligence, human rights and IHL, probably have different origin, but they all share the same concept. Antonio called it triangular relationship, but because of this same concept, same structure, these 4 categories of rules, I think, can be referred to from each other, so that we can find common feature or element of due diligence concept. And Japanese government actually published a position paper on the application of international law. And the Japanese government position paper referred to seriousness and capacity to influence as a key elements in applying the due diligence principle. And that analysis was based on not only jurisprudence in the court standard judgment, but also genocide convention judgment, and also Alabama arbitral award. These are in a different areas, but still you can understand the concept of due diligence better by referring to different kinds of due diligence. So I think in short, states or governments should be careful about applying right set of rules to the particular situation. So distinction between these four categories are necessary for the government, but still cross reference to different kinds of due diligence is useful in finding out common feature or common nature, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, well, let me actually, I think we've gone so long in this conversation without, there's kind of, to my mind, there's a looming elephant in the room, and that's sovereignty. In addition to this existential debate we described at the outset about due diligence, I think states have also spent the last few years debating the scope of their sovereign rights and responsibilities in cyberspace. And I wondered, Talita or Antonio, can you talk a little bit about how and why the question of sovereignty, whether as a positive, implicating positive rights or negative rights and responsibilities, how does that implicate your research and findings, if at all?
Yes, thank you, Duncan. I'll take this one. Indeed, you're right that it has been at the center of debates between states, but usually when states talk about sovereignty is to protect themselves, to say, you should keep out of my stuff, do not enter, do not intrude into my systems, into my infrastructure. It's always brought forward, or at least most of the times, as something that protects the states, but actually that's not the whole story, and that's something that we try to highlight in the report, that sovereignty is not just protected by international law, but sovereignty is defined by international law, and every assumption by a state that they have sovereignty over something or some persons implies that they also have a responsibility for that person or object or event. Sovereignty, in fact, is just a manifestation of the function of a state. States were created to ensure the well-being of a society, and ensuring the well-being of a society means guaranteeing the rights of individuals inside the borders and ensuring that that society can coexist peacefully with other societies outside of the borders. And we should read sovereignty, even when we talk about information and communication technologies, in that sense, not just as something that protects the prerogatives of a state, but also as something that implies duties and responsibilities for the community that the state represents and the other equally sovereign entities with which the state interacts and must coexist. In fact, we say that the rule of due diligence, or rather, the rules that require a due diligence standard are one step into ensuring that several digital sovereigns can peacefully coexist. And let me say one other thing before then giving you back the floor. When we talk about the rules concerning diligent behavior to prevent certain harms, these are also a corollary of the function of a sovereign. These are precisely envisaged for the protection of the community that lives inside the state and the protection of the other entities with which the state interacts. When a state does not allow a certain harmful operation to occur on its infrastructure, it's actually manifesting its sovereign nature, its power to act for the well-being of the community it represents and the community in which it stands. I hope this abstract terminology doesn't throw you too much out of the way, but Talita will be more precise on the specifics of what this means for our project when talking about jurisdiction.
But can I just
of
something
course.
So there's a very good quote, a very powerful quote from the Island of Palmas case, which is a very, very old arbitral case, which encapsulates precisely what Antonio just said. And if I can read it out, we quote this in our report. And the tribunal concluded that the right to territorial sovereignty has a corollary duty, the obligation to protect within the territory the rights of other states, in particular the right to integrity and inviolability in peace and in war. So that really encapsulates what Antonio is saying, that sovereignty is not just about power, but that's responsibility. And that's why we say that due diligence is a corollary of sovereignty in that sense. Yeah.
Right. So I like to simplify it because maybe I have too much popular culture in my background, is the Peter Parker principle, right? The with great power comes great responsibility line that they seem to find. But you know, I'm happy to take it from Max Huber as well.
It's the Superwoman principle.
Wonderful. That's even better. Talita, can I stay with you for a second, though? I think one of the things, the sovereignty discussion we've been having for well over a decade now, right? And I think people have different views on not just the rights and responsibilities, but whether sovereignty then manifests as a rule or not. And obviously that implicates particularly the Corfu Channel, right? Because if sovereignty is a hard rule, then it's captured by Corfu Channel in a way it might not if it's just a background principle. But what I think your report does is kind of a novel move in suggesting states and scholars have to do more to explore the role of jurisdiction for due diligence purposes. And can you talk a little bit about how you understand, and here I'm talking about the international rules on prescriptive or enforcement jurisdiction. How do they impact your understandings of due diligence? Particularly, what about the territorial jurisdiction model that we're so used to international lawyers applying? How does that extend in this context?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a very good question. So as I said, the starting point is that due diligence is a corollary of sovereignty. It derives from sovereignty. And so as a consequence, sovereignty triggers. So sovereignty, whether it's manifested in jurisdiction or another type of state power, that triggers due diligence obligations, as I said. So, and also following on from what Antonio said. So that's the first way in which jurisdiction as a manifestation of sovereignty is relevant to due diligence. It triggers duties of due diligence, right? So it triggers, for example, the Corfu Channel principle or rule. It triggers the no harm principle, and the concept of jurisdiction under human rights law also triggers positive human rights obligations or state obligations to exercise due diligence to protect human rights. It doesn't play that much of a role in IHL, but it does play a role in the other way, in the second dimension, in which sovereignty is relevant or jurisdiction is relevant to the diligence. And that is by limiting the scope of duties or measures that states have to adopt when exercising or when fulfilling their due diligence obligations in cyber and other contexts. So jurisdiction is really what defines the extent to which states are going to be able to take due diligence by means of different measures. And that's where our sort of our approach to enforcement jurisdiction and prescriptive jurisdiction comes in, because we see these two types of jurisdiction as measures to give effect to these different due diligence rules. So they don't just trigger due diligence, but they also give effect to due diligence obligations. And so depending on how broad or how narrow we understand sovereignty and jurisdiction, that is going to impact the measures that states are going to be able to exercise or to adopt when fulfilling their due diligence duties. So when it comes to enforcement jurisdiction, obviously there are limitations, right? Territorial limitations. And I guess that's Harold's question in the Q&A, right? And if I can answer that very briefly, and I can go back to that question in a second, but the idea is that, as we all know, enforcement jurisdiction is territorial. So there is no way out, right? So states cannot just go invading other countries to seize their information communications technologies, their servers and their cables and whatever, because that's not possible. That's contrary to international law, right? That's contrary to territorial sovereignty. But what they can do is exercise other forms of jurisdiction. And that's our point about prescriptive and to some extent adjudicative jurisdiction, because states have the power to adopt legislation to regulate these matters, right? They can do that by adopting cybercrime legislation. If you're talking about criminal law, for example, there are a number of bases under which states can adopt criminal legislation. So the principle of nationality, active nationality, we can talk about passive nationality, the protective principle, even universal jurisdiction, if you're talking about cyber-enabled universal jurisdiction crimes, international crimes, right? So there are a number of bases that empower states to enact legislation to counter these harms, to exercise due diligence. And there's also adjudication that follows on from that, right? So there are various ways in which states can do that. And if you're talking about civil law, then we have even less limits. So think about the tort statute in the US, right? Regulating kind of like tort harms that might literally arise in the whole world, even though there must be a link between the claimant and the territory where the claim is made. So, I mean, there are a number of ways that states can use their jurisdiction, use their power to fulfill their due diligence obligations, and that's why we thought it would be helpful to draw this connection between jurisdiction and due diligence. And in the human rights context, it's even more important for us to talk about jurisdiction because, as we all know, jurisdiction in the human rights sense, it limits, right? It limits the scope of states' human rights obligations. And there, I think it's really important for us to move away from a territorial approach or even a personal, purely physical approach to jurisdiction and to sort of like evolve that notion into a more functional approach, because many human rights violations, they don't have a physical component to them, not necessarily physical, and you can affect the enjoyment of individual rights remotely. And the main example of this is surveillance, right? And data collection. And so we need to move away from this territorialized physical notion of jurisdiction in the human rights context. And states need to be exercising different forms of jurisdiction to exercise due diligence. I hope that makes sense, but yeah, it's a little bit complicated.
Well, I think all things with jurisdiction are complicated, but I think, you know, the report's to be commended for, you know, I think bringing in that as a vehicle for understanding, you know, for tied together with sovereignty and helping us maybe move some of the dialogue forward. With looking at the time, I do want to make sure we have some time for questions and answers. And I think thank you for seeing and responding to Harold Koh's question along the way. So obviously, if the other panelists see the opportunities to do so, feel free. But can we turn a little bit now? We've talked about you know, why the need for this project, what the harms that we're worried about for these due diligence obligations, and unpacked what that obligation looks like and how it's situated in an international legal order with sovereignty, rights, and responsibilities, with jurisdictional obligations and limits. Let's talk about compliance and effectiveness for a little bit. You know, particularly like, what does compliance with these due diligence duties look like in cyberspace? And maybe in the interest of time, Joanna, and report surveys a number of measures that might constitute compliance, or what Talita and Antonio describe as implementation: legal measures, technical procedural measures, organizational measures, capacity building measures, cooperative mechanisms. If you or we had to prioritize them among these, are there any of these that particularly resonated with you, or any that you found more important than others? And maybe this time, Joanna, maybe I'd start with you.
Thank you. Indeed, due diligence is an exciting topic, and I welcome the fact that we have like-minded researchers speaking here, and I fully support everything that was said. Again, in practical terms, thank you for asking the pragmatic question to me first. I believe this is about building trust. The more I think and listen about due diligence, the more I understand it's merely a tool to advance international trust and peace building. In that context, in terms of building trust, CBMs, confidence building measures, I think are the next step for us. So we do not seem to be ready to institute any kind of an organization that would facilitate implementing due diligence. So we need to start with confidence building measures in terms of building capacity, in terms of cooperating together. From among the ones that our authors have listed, I would for now focus on cooperative mechanisms. So we might want to figure out how to ensure that this flexible standard is supported with the confidence and based on trust among states. And we are more than ready, also based on this report, to recommend specific measures which may be taken. And the experiences from various jurisdictions, including the EU's one, are to ready-made solutions that we might want to adapt and advance. But at this point, I'm not certain we are ready to institute any further this building consensus around due diligence, then focusing on organizational measures, possibly building capacity around due diligence, what it is, and why it might be useful. As we progress, these might advance into finding technical measures to ensure due diligence that will be supported by all the partners who are already convinced that this approach of prevention is far better than acting alone in the global cyberspace, possibly also through active cyber defense. So from among the list our authors have indicated there, I think we are ready to advance cooperation, and the next steps just might follow. I'm going to stop here, looking forward to the Q&A session. Thank you.
And Tomohiro, I also, invite the same question to you in terms of your reactions to the various means of implementation described.
Thank you. This year's GGE report did not go much further on the application of international law itself, but it had come up with several practical things to do to promote cooperation among states. And I totally agree with Joanna that cooperation is a very important way to move ahead with this due diligence. For example, DG report, paragraph 30 to 34, I think, or 33, dealing with practical cooperation, including the notification and the acknowledgement of receipt of the notification. This might sound a little bit too, I think, primitive way of cooperation, but even the simple acknowledgement of the received of notification is really important to start something with each other. And the report also talks about criminal cooperation, cooperation in the area of criminal jurisdiction investigation. We don't have a wide acceptance of Budapest Cybercrime Convention, but still we can cooperate in sharing information and so on. And the report also talks about kind of surveillance or maybe critical infrastructure related measures to prevent attack on this infrastructure. These are the elements which states have somehow agreed, and we can start with these elements and implement these paragraphs into action so that we can strengthen the observance of due diligence obligation. Thank you.
I want to get to an effectiveness question, but maybe if I could invite Talita and Antonio, just briefly, one of the things, I wonder if you have a response to this, one of the things I was struck by is your implementation is always about broad categories and mechanisms. I wonder, is there a utility, or can you give examples of like what a concrete example of what compliance or non-compliance might look like in the cyber context? Have we seen, for example, anything that you would look at and say that's a violation of either the Corfu channel or the no harm principle, or as Joanna suggests, are we not there yet and we should be focused, as your report does, on the broader challenges of cooperation and capacity building?
So perhaps I may go first here. I think, without naming names, but let's assume that there is an attack, a cyber operation that causes harm in country A, and country A knows that the operation originates in country B. Refusal to exchange information So if country A asks state B, can you please cooperate, give me some information on the area from which this cyber operation originates, on the persons that may be involved, refusal to cooperate in that case, in my personal opinion, I don't want to speak for Talita, but I guess she agrees, would be a violation of several of the rules that we identify. Another violation, example of non-compliance would be avoiding to pass domestic cybercrime legislation that makes it impossible to investigate and prosecute effectively people that have been involved in harmful cyber operations. This could be, for example, an example of non-compliance with positive duties under international human rights law for the protection of several human rights. So it can be very concrete. It doesn't need to be very broad issues. Another example of compliance could be the establishment of emergency response teams and the facilitation of establishment of emergency response teams within a country that ensures that whenever there is a harmful cyber operation, it can be tackled immediately and effectively. And when we talk about due diligence at the end, there is a misconception that we should avoid the harmful cyber operation in the first place. But that's not it. That what these rules oblige states to do is to ensure that they are prepared to respond when these cyber operations occur. It's about minimizing risks. When there are criticisms of the Corfu Channel rule, saying that states would never agree that there is a duty to prevent harmful cyber operations. But I think this is the wrong framework for it. States have a duty to do everything they can to minimize as possible the risk that those harmful cyber operations occur and cause harm. It's not that they have to prevent Operation X or Operation Y. But they have to do their homeworks. They have to put in place the measures that would minimize that risk. And when that operation occurs, act promptly and effectively. Some of the ways that I mentioned: exchanging information, exchanging know-how, investigating, prosecuting, ensuring before doing that you have a national legislation for doing that, making sure that you have appropriate organizational structures within your country that can respond to this kind of incidents. These are ways of complying. You do not need as a state to implement and do all of these things. Because, of course, these rules that have a due diligence standard give some flexibility, but some things must be done. And whether a state has complied or not will depend on their capacity, on their ability to know that a certain harmful cyber operation is coming on or is likely to occur. So there are variations, but surely the state must show that they have done their best to minimize the risk or to respond to the operation.
Yeah.
So if just in the interest of time, I want to bring in a question from the audience, then that I think goes to both your response, Antonio, and Tomohiro's statement, which was Trianta Fialos, I'm going to say this wrong, and my apologies, Kouloufakos asks about the protection of critical infrastructure, the public core of the internet. We talked a little bit about that, and we've talked about the OEWG report and the GG. The question doesn't ask this, but I'll add the GGE. And the question is, how do we see the use of cyber norms bolstering the application of due diligence and the no harm principle in cyberspace? And I think that's particularly relevant if you haven't seen the consensus GGE report from May. As Tomohiro mentioned, there is a lot, not in the international law section, but in the norm section, that sounds very sympathetic, if not in alignment with what this report characterizes as international law. So maybe I first invite the report's authors, Talita or Antonio. How do you think about the linkage between this responsible norms of state behavior, which elaborate due diligence ideas, and your own project?
Yeah, so the first thing, so two points there. So the first thing that I'd say is that it is a misconception to think that the norms of responsible state behavior replace or derogate or displace existing rules of international law. So that's the first thing. So some people have made the argument that because states have recognized due diligence in the form of norms of responsible state behavior, that means that due diligence is not a rule of international law. That is a fallacy, because policy recommendations, they cannot displace existing rules of international law, right? Rules of international law are there, and if they apply, they continue to exist regardless of whatever policy recommendation states make for whatever political policy reasons. So that's the first thing that we need to consider. And the second thing that follows on from that is that actually the norms of responsible state behavior, they complement the interpretation and the application and the implementation of due diligence in particular scenarios. So they are, in a way, they build on existing rules. And if I can say this, they are a cyber manifestation of existing rules of due diligence. So they are actually helpful in helping us understand how these general norms of rules of due diligence apply in the cyber, are to be interpreted and applied in the cyber context. So that's how I would see the relationship between the two.
I invite any of the other responses to that question from either of the panelists, or shall we? All right. I see there's I kind of want to try. I do have some. I still have questions of my own, but I want to defer to the audience. Earl Mendez asked a question on, whether or not we could think about this in terms of regional forms of public international law. That is, building off the North Sea continental shelf case, or what Canada's done with respect to the Arctic and possible sea passages. Like, what would happen if, for example, NATO countries adopted the due diligence principle? Could that be a way to start the process of due diligence as a general rule of public international law? This may presume it's not, but I'll post the question and invite. Maybe I'll start again with you, Talita and Antonio, on your own responses, and then open it up if Joanna or Tomohiro have thoughts as well.
So I'd say yes, it could help to promote, but it's not necessary, because I think that the whole idea of due diligence is this flexibility, right? It's to give effect to the idea of common but differentiated responsibilities, right? So each and every state will do what it can based on its financial, human resources, and the whole idea of the standard is to give that sort of like margin of appreciation and discretion as to how states are going to implement it. So maybe it will help to promote the rules on a policy level, sure. But is this necessary on the legal level? I wouldn't say so.
Yeah, and if I may add, of course, regional organizations and regional fora may be a venue where states comply with their duty to behave diligently, not only necessarily in the field of cooperative measures, but, for example, also in the field of capacity building. If we intend, as we do, that capacity building is a way to comply with rules that requiring diligent behavior, we have several examples of practice from regional organizations establishing joint initiatives of capacity building to ensure, for example, that they have personnel that has the knowledge and technical skills to respond effectively to cyber incidents. They can exchange know-how, they can exchange practices. This is all a way to behave diligently and do those homeworks, ensure that you have that preparedness then to comply with your duties to protect certain beneficiaries if an incident occurs. So yeah, that's my answer.
Any thoughts from our panelists, Joanna or Tomo? Please, Tomohiro, please.
I think regional approach is useful in capacity building, but when it comes to the rules, I think we need some global international rule because of the this extraordinary reach of internet. You need something common between different regions. Budapest Convention was kind of regional approach to the cybercrime convention, but it didn't work. And we are now starting to discuss UN Convention on cybercrime. So we cannot avoid discussion in the global, international stage, I think. Thank you.
All right, I want to shift because as I promised, can we talk a little bit about the effectiveness of what I think you very effectively laid out in the report? And I'll flag this again at the end, but it is worth flagging now that the report is available for free on the ELAC website. So make sure I don't forget that. But our viewers can access it, or anybody who watches this after the fact. Antonio, you talked about the way capacity building is a way to implement the standard, but can you also isn't there a limitation implied in the effectiveness of these obligations or these duties by that limitation of capacity and also the knowledge? I mean, are they barriers to these obligations, having effect in, as you say, creating more peaceful relations among states, or minimizing this harm? How do you as authors think about these limitations that you identify on the obligation impacting its effectiveness?
Yeah, thank you, Duncan. Perhaps I can tackle capacity and then Talita can talk a little bit about knowledge. As to capacity, you mentioned it at the beginning. We think of capacity to respond to harmful cyber operations as being, of course, differentiated between all states, but with a common floor. There is a minimum core that every state is expected to do in order to be able to comply with their obligations to behave diligently. A minimum core that, if it's not respected, will mean that the state is not behaving diligently, it's behaving negligently. I think some of these minimum core obligations really do not require any capacity at all. For example, adopting a national framework for tackling harmful cyber operations and cybercrime doesn't require a particular capacity. In fact, just requires the regular attribute of a state of having a legislator. And another measure that I mentioned that we write in the report is conducting investigations and prosecutions. These just requires having a functioning justice system, which may be, of course, not the case in some states, but this is not something that depends on capacity. If a state doesn't have a functioning justice system,
then it's a failed state.
Then it's not a state that it's fulfilling its attributes of statehood. So there is really a floor below which you cannot go.
Yeah.
Above that floor, of course, states that have greater technical possibilities are expected to do more, to adopt more technical measures, to have more complex organizational structures. And one may think, well, isn't this a counter incentive for states to progress in their knowledge of the technology so that they have lesser obligations? But I think this would never happen. All states want to have the maximum technological advancement possible. And while they reach that, their power grows and their responsibility also grows, and the expectation of what would be considered diligent behavior from that state also grows. You mentioned it before, Duncan, the Peter Parker principle.
Superwoman.
Superwoman, as Talita says. So that's the idea. As for knowledge, I can have Talita.
So just to follow up on that, I don't think that the capacity requirement is a limitation. I actually think it's the opposite. I think that's the main strength of the rule, because it allows states that sort of, like what I said, the margin of discretion to actually try and do their best, use their resources, their available resources to do what they can to do their best efforts in preventing, redressing, mitigating, investigating harms. On the knowledge requirement, so my answer will be very short. 2 points there. So the first thing is, of course, it would be unfair to expect that states prevent or redress harms that they don't know of, right? That would be very unfair. How can anyone prevent something that they don't know about? But actual knowledge is no excuse for inaction, because the idea is, and across all due diligence obligations, we find also a constructive knowledge requirements. So, and that again, sort of like ties back to the whole idea of due diligence as a reasonable standard of care. So if it would be reasonable for that state to know of a certain harm, of a certain forthcoming harm, then the fact that the actual state didn't know doesn't really matter. What matters is what would be reasonable in the circumstances to expect from that state based on what the state should have known. So yeah.
Well, wonderful. I'm looking at the clock. We have 3 minutes left, and so as I like to do with these things, I wanted to just give everyone an opportunity to make a closing remark, not remarks, because we don't have time. And if I can frame it, I'll put out the question, but feel free to resist the question. And maybe I'd start with you, Joanna, then Tomohiro, then our report authors. What's the main takeaway? What's the one thing that you would take away, either from the report or today's conversation, that you'd want anyone who's been with us for the last 90 minutes to come away with? Joanna?
Thank you, Duncan. I'll be brief. Due diligence is a binding international obligation upon states. Let's work together to put that into operational details. I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
And Tomohiro-san.
Yeah, I think the very important point of this report is that due diligence obligation exists under international law. So states should cooperate with each other to implement this obligation. And in that sense, I totally agree with Joanna. Thank you.
I'm detecting a theme that I'm suspecting our report's authors will not dispute, since they wrote the report. But as to, I mean, you have this, it's a 200+ page report. What, I'll let you choose who goes first. But what is the one thing, that you would like to see coming out of this, assuming we've moved beyond the internet, that due diligence is binding under international law, we've got past that existential. What else would you like to see viewers or readers take away?
Perhaps I start so that I let Talita conclude, and I should underline that Talita has written the majority of the report, and I've supported her. We have written many parts together, but I have to say that she has written more, so this should be recognized. But the main takeaway for me is that we should not forget that there are beneficiaries of these obligations requiring diligent behavior. And when we talk about rules of international law, we should not only think about what the obligation is for the state or the duty bearer, but who ultimately benefits from it. And if we have states behaving diligently when using information and communication technologies, all people will benefit from it.
Yeah, so for me, I completely agree with that. And I mean, can I just say like 2 takeaways, if I may? So one is precisely the one. So I think that our minds are pretty much aligned on this, and that is the fact that states are abstract entities, right? They don't exist, and the technology itself is not alive. So what we're talking about is human beings. We're talking about making lives better, right? And we always need to think about human beings when we talk about diligence, because that's the ultimate aim of everything that we do, right? To protect them, to make sure that they're not harmed. And whether we're talking about social media, whether we're talking about ransomware, disinformation, it's all about individuals. So my call is for a human-centric approach to due diligence. And the other takeaway is that, for states from a strategic point of view, so excluding like legal considerations and other sort of like more formal considerations, from a strategic perspective, it's counterproductive for states to continue to deny due diligence, because it could give them a powerful claim of action to actually, point fingers to those states that are breaching the rule. So that's it for me.
So a human-centric rejection of further denials by states to their obligation or obligations. I guess for me, the big takeaway is that patchwork, right? That to the extent that we've for too long kind of treated this as a monolithic concept, and that by treating it as a standard, we can look and find, I don't think anyone would dispute its manifestation in the human rights context or the international human rights context. So why deny it when it comes to the no harm principle or the Corfu channel that we all get as first year international law students, for those of you who've gone into a career in international law. But with that, I think we're 1 minute over time. So my apologies as moderator. I failed you in keeping to the 90-minute queue. But let me just close by thanking, first of all, our inspiration for this project, the government of Japan, Tomohiro. Joanna, thank you for commenting. Talita and Antonio, thank you for authoring this report that, again, you can access for free on the website of ELAC. And let me thank ELAC for hosting this event. It's been great to be a moderator and get to kind of organize this discussion. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope those of you who've been with us live and those of you who watch us later will as well. So thanks, and congratulations to the report's authors.
Thank you, and thank you for moderating.